Some stories do not begin with grand entrances, ballrooms filled with laughter, or families who already have everything. Some of the most powerful stories begin in quiet corners of hospitals, where lives hang between fragility and hope. And in this story, it all began with a woman whose world was small, but whose heart was larger than she could ever measure. Her name was Emily. Emily was a nurse, and not the kind you see only walking quickly through corridors with clipboards in hand, detached and clinical. She was the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's name, who carried extra tissues in her pocket because she knew that tears were inevitable, who whispered words of comfort at midnight when the machines beeped and fear filled the sterile rooms. She was not wealthy. In fact, her life outside the hospital walls was very modest. She lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint on the walls and a leaky faucet in the kitchen. She often had to count every dollar at the grocery store to make sure she didn't overspend. Yet she never complained. Emily's dream was simple. One day she hoped to buy a small house of her own. Not a mansion, not a luxurious villa, but a little home with a garden where she could plant flowers, a place she could finally call hers. But Emily didn't know that her life was about to collide with someone from a very different world. One late evening, a young man was rushed into the hospital after an accident. His name was Alexander. He was tall, striking, with eyes that carried both arrogance and pain. He came from wealth, the kind of wealth that made newspapers talk and photographers chase. His family was known for owning businesses, properties, and everything money could buy. Yet as he lay in that hospital bed, unconscious and vulnerable, none of that mattered. Money could not keep bones from breaking, it could not mend bruises, and it could not erase fear. Emily was assigned to his care. When she first walked into his room, she did not think of his last name, or his family, or the wealth that surrounded him. She simply saw another patient, another human being in need of care. She checked his vitals, adjusted his and whispered softly, though he could not yet hear her, "You're safe now. We'll take care of you." Days turned into weeks, and Alexander slowly began to heal. When he opened his eyes, the first face he saw was Emily's. She was adjusting the blinds to let in a ray of morning sunlight. He studied her silently. She wasn't glamorous like the women he often saw at parties or events. Her hair was tied back neatly, her uniform plain, her makeup minimal. But there was something in her expression, something gentle yet unshakable, that caught his attention. She smiled at him, a smile that reached her eyes and said, "Good morning. You've been through a lot, but you're getting stronger." Alexander wasn't used to people speaking to him like that, with warmth but without awe. Most people around him either wanted something from him or treated him as if he were untouchable. But Emily treated him like a person, and though his body ached, his pride was wounded, and his future uncertain, he found comfort in her presence. In the days that followed, Emily became more than just his nurse. She became his anchor. She listened when he spoke about his frustration, about feeling trapped in a bed when he was used to commanding boardrooms and traveling the world. She brought him extra blankets when the nights grew cold. She laughed at his sarcastic remarks, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she truly found humor in his sharp wit. And something began to change inside Alexander. He started to look forward to her visits, to the sound of her footsteps approaching, to the calm in her voice. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he was beginning to see the world through her eyes, the world of someone who had very little yet gave so much. One evening, as Emily helped him adjust his pillow, Alexander asked her softly, "Why do you do this? Why do you care so much?" Emily looked at him, a little surprised by the question, and replied, "Because people need kindness, and I believe kindness can heal just as much as medicine does. Maybe not the body, but the heart." Her words stayed with him long after she left the room. Alexander began asking her more about herself. He learned about her modest apartment, about her long shifts, about the nights she went home so exhausted she could barely stand. And then she told him about her dream. She didn't say it with bitterness or longing, but with quiet hope. "One day," she said, "I'd like to have a small house, nothing grand, just a place where I can plant roses in the garden. A place I can call home." It struck Alexander deeply. Here was a woman who deserved the world, and yet all she dreamed of was a simple house. As the weeks passed, Alexander found himself changing in ways he didn't expect. He was no longer restless to leave the hospital just to return to his old life of endless parties and empty conversations. Instead, he found peace in the simplicity of Emily's company. He noticed the little things, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way she hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, the way she treated even the most difficult patients with patience and grace. And slowly, almost against his will, Alexander felt something growing inside him. It wasn't just gratitude for her care, nor admiration for her kindness. It was something deeper, something that scared him but also warmed him in a way nothing else ever had. He was falling in love. But love was complicated. He was a man of wealth. She was a woman of humble means. Their worlds were so different that even the thought of them together seemed impossible. And yet, every time Emily walked into the room, every time she smiled at him, he felt hope whispering that maybe, just maybe, love could bridge even the widest gaps. Little did they both know, their journey was only beginning. What started as a nurse caring for her patient was about to become a story of transformation, of love that didn't follow the rules, and of dreams that would take shape in ways neither of them could predict. And though the ending would not be the one people expected, the story of a wedding, vows, and rings, it would be something even more powerful. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories are not about what is lost or gained, but about what is discovered in the quiet spaces between two hearts. For Alexander, the days inside the hospital were no longer a blur of sterile walls and suffocating silence. They became chapters in an unexpected book of rediscovery. He was still healing, his body still reminding him of pain with every small movement, but his heart was awakening to something he had never allowed himself to feel with such intensity. It wasn't just Emily's kindness that drew him in. It was the way she moved through life. Alexander had grown up surrounded by extravagance, but also by emptiness. He had attended parties where chandeliers sparkled like galaxies and glasses overflowed with champagne, but he couldn't remember a single conversation that truly mattered. Yet in Emily's presence, even the smallest exchange carried weight. Even silence had meaning. One morning, Alexander asked her, "Don't you ever wish for more? Don't you wish you had a life different from this?" Emily looked at him thoughtfully as she placed a glass of water by his bed. "I used to," she admitted softly. "When I was younger, I thought happiness meant having what everyone else had. Bigger houses, better clothes, more money. But then I realized something. What good is a mansion if you come home and no one is waiting for you? What good is wealth if you can't sleep at night because your heart is heavy? For me, happiness isn't about more. It's about enough. Enough to live, enough to share, enough to feel safe. That's all." Her words settled into him like a truth he had always known but never wanted to face. He had everything, more than enough of what the world envied, but not once had he felt the peace Emily described. From that day on, Alexander didn't just listen to her words, he studied her life. He noticed the weariness in her eyes when her shift stretched long hours, yet also the quiet joy she carried in small victories. When a patient finally walked again, when someone's fever broke, when she saw a child smile after days of fear, she gave her whole heart to strangers, expecting nothing in return, and it made Alexander realize how selfish he had been for most of his life. One night, after a difficult day when his pain was sharper and frustration almost broke him, Emily found him staring out the window. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, "why some people are given everything and others are left with so little? Why me, born into privilege, wasted so much of it, while people like you work tirelessly and dream only of a small house?" Emily stood beside him, her gaze following the distant city lights. "Maybe life isn't fair," she said honestly, "but maybe fairness isn't the point. Maybe the point is what we choose to do with what we're given. Some people waste abundance, others make miracles out of scarcity. I believe we all have a choice." Those words sank into him like a stone falling into still water, sending ripples deep into his soul. And with each day, Alexander made a choice he didn't even fully understand. He chose to open up, He told her stories about his childhood, about how his parents were often too busy building their empire to notice him, about the loneliness he felt in houses that echoed with silence. He confessed how tired he was of pretending he enjoyed the life he lived, when deep inside he felt empty. Emily listened, not with pity, but with a kind of understanding that made him feel seen for the first time. She never judged him, never reminded him of how privileged he was compared to others. Instead, she gave him something no one else ever had: compassion without condition. It wasn't long before Alexander realized he was looking forward to every single moment with her. The way she handed him his medicine with a gentle touch. The way she asked how he was really feeling, not just physically but inside. The way her laughter filled the room and made the sterile walls feel alive. But with these growing feelings came fear. Alexander knew his world and Emily's world were not meant to collide. Society didn't forgive such crossings easily. What would people say if they saw him, heir to a vast fortune, falling for a nurse who lived paycheck to paycheck? What would his family say? What would hers? One evening, unable to hold it back any longer, he asked her directly, "Do you believe two people from completely different worlds can find happiness together?" Emily froze, caught off guard by the weight of his question. She lowered her eyes, then slowly replied, "I think love doesn't ask about the size of your house or the money in your bank account. Love only asks if your heart is willing. But sometimes the world makes it complicated. Sometimes love has to fight to exist." Her words both comforted him and tore at him. He wanted to tell her then, in that very moment, how much he was beginning to care for her. But something held him back. Fear that his confession would scare her away. Fear that it would ruin the fragile balance they had built. So he remained silent, even though his heart screamed with words he couldn't yet say. Meanwhile, Emily was fighting her own battle. She had begun to notice the way Alexander looked at her, the way his eyes lingered a second too long, the way his tone softened only when speaking to her. And against her better judgment, she felt her own heart respond. But she reminded herself of her place. She was his nurse. He was her patient. And beyond that, he belonged to a world she could never fit into. Falling for him was dangerous, foolish, maybe even impossible. Yet her heart didn't seem to understand the word impossible. The hospital became their universe, a place where time stretched and the outside world seemed to fade. And in that universe, something rare was blooming, something fragile and beautiful. It was more than attraction, more than companionship. It was the beginning of love. And though neither of them had spoken the truth aloud, both could feel it in the quiet moments, in the unspoken silences, in the way their souls seemed to recognize each other. But outside the walls of that room, reality was waiting. Families, expectations, wealth, and the rules of society would soon test what was growing between them. For now, they lived in a fragile bubble of hope, but every bubble eventually has to face the sharp edge of truth. And when it came, it would change everything. The day Alexander was finally discharged from the hospital arrived with both joy and an ache that neither he nor Emily were ready to face. He had been preparing for it physically, regaining enough strength to leave, but emotionally he felt like he was losing something far greater than his health had ever taken from him. Emily came into his room that morning with her usual warmth, but her smile seemed fragile, almost forced. She set his chart down, checked his vitals, and said, "You're ready to go home." Home. The word should have felt like freedom, but instead, it felt like a chain pulling him away from the only place where he had truly begun to feel alive. He looked at Emily, standing there with her calm professionalism, and for a moment, he almost told her everything. Almost. But the weight of silence won. As he packed his few belongings, Alexander kept glancing at her, memorizing the curve of her smile, the gentleness in her eyes, the sound of her voice. He didn't know if he would ever see her again once he stepped out those doors. When the time came, she walked him to the entrance. "Take care of yourself, Alexander," she said softly. He hesitated, gripping the handle of his suitcase. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling with words unsaid. "For everything." Emily nodded, forcing her heart to remain steady. "It's what I do." But as she watched him leave, Every fiber of her being screamed that he was more than just another patient. She turned away before her tears could betray her. Life after the hospital was supposed to return to normal for Alexander, but nothing felt normal anymore. He walked into his grand family estate, greeted by marble floors and gilded chandeliers, but the house felt colder than ever. The walls echoed with emptiness. He ate at long dining tables where the silence was suffocating, and every night he lay in a bed that felt more like a cage than a place of rest. He thought of Emily constantly, her laughter, her kindness, her honesty. He missed her like a man stranded in a desert misses water. At the hospital, Emily tried to bury herself in work. She told herself she had to forget him, that he was part of a world she didn't belong to. But late at night, when she walked home through quiet streets, she would catch herself imagining what it would be like to see him again, to sit across from him in a little cafe, to talk without the barrier of her uniform, without the walls of the hospital between them. Weeks passed, and the distance between them grew heavier. Yet fate has a strange way of weaving its threads, and sometimes it brings two people back together when they least expect it. One evening, Emily was walking home after a double shift. The city was alive with lights, but her body was heavy with exhaustion. She stopped by a small bakery to buy a piece of bread for dinner. As she stepped outside, struggling with her tired steps, a sleek black car pulled up by the curb. The tinted window rolled down, and there he was, Alexander. For a moment, Emily froze, unsure if her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her. But it was real. His eyes, his smile, the warmth she remembered so vividly. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying both relief and longing. "I was hoping I'd find you." She blinked in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I tried to move on," he admitted, his words raw and unfiltered. "I thought maybe it was just gratitude or admiration, but Emily, I can't stop thinking about you. I need to see you. I need to know if—" He paused, swallowing the fear in his throat. "If what I'm feeling is only mine, or if you feel it too." Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She wanted to deny it, to protect herself, but the truth shone in her eyes before her lips could form words. "Alexander," she whispered, "you don't know what you're saying. You live in a world I don't belong to." "Then let me change my world," he said firmly. "Because what is all of this worth if I can't share it with someone who makes me feel alive?" Emily shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "It's not that simple. People won't understand. They'll look at us and see only what separates us. They'll judge. They'll whisper." "Let them whisper," Alexander interrupted. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to what people expect of me, and it's left me empty. For once, I want to live for myself. For once, I want to fight for something real." His conviction shook her because deep down it was what she wanted too. But fear was a stubborn enemy. She looked down at the bag of bread in her hands, a symbol of her modest, fragile life, and then back at him, standing there with all the power of wealth and choice at his disposal. "I'm not asking you to change your life," he said, reading the conflict in her silence. "I'm asking if you'll let me be part of it. If you'll let me walk beside you, even if it means I have to leave parts of my world behind." For a long moment, Emily couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, her heart was racing, and every thought in her head was at war with her heart. Finally, she whispered, "I'm scared." Alexander stepped closer, his voice gentle. "So am I. But maybe that's how we know it's worth it." In that fragile moment, under the glow of city lights, something shifted. The distance between them felt smaller. The walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. Neither of them knew what lay ahead. They didn't know how the world would react, or how difficult the path might become. But for the first time, both were willing to take the first step into the unknown. And so, the story of Emily and Alexander began not in the safety of hospital walls, but out in the vast, unpredictable world, where love would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. In the weeks that followed their unexpected reunion, Emily and Alexander began to weave something fragile but extraordinary. Their worlds, though so different, collided in secret corners of the city, where judgment couldn't follow them. They met at small cafes, where Alexander insisted on sitting by the window, watching her laugh as if it were the only view worth seeing. They walked through quiet parks late at night, Emily carrying a paper bag with leftovers from her shift, while Alexander carried nothing but the desire to be near her. To Emily, these moments were like stolen pages from a story that didn't belong to her. She often reminded herself that he was Alexander Pierce, the heir to a fortune, the man who had grown up in a house with more rooms than she could count. And she was just a nurse, saving every penny, dreaming of one day buying a little house of her own. Yet when they were together, those differences melted away. He never spoke to her as if she were beneath him, never flaunted his wealth or made her feel small. Instead, he listened to her fears, her dreams, her memories of childhood. He was fascinated by her determination, her quiet strength, the way she found beauty in simple things. But not everyone was blind to their growing bond. One afternoon, Alexander invited her to a gallery opening hosted by an old family friend. Emily hesitated, but he convinced her, saying he wanted her by his side, wanted her to be part of his world, even if only for one night. She wore the simplest dress she owned, navy blue with sleeves she had mended herself. To her, it was neat, modest, respectable. To the glittering crowd at the gallery, it was out of place. When they entered together, whispers began almost immediately. Women in diamond necklaces leaned into each other, eyes darting toward Emily. Men in tailored suits looked at Alexander with smirks that said, "What is he doing with her?" Emily felt their stares like knives against her skin. She wanted to leave, but Alexander held her hand tightly, grounding her. "Ignore them," he whispered. "You belong here with me." She tried to smile, but her heart ached. She had always been strong, but this kind of scrutiny was new, cruel, and suffocating. Then one woman, a family acquaintance of Alexander's, approached them. With a smile as sharp as glass, she said, "Alexander, darling, it's wonderful to see you. And who is this?" Her eyes raked over Emily's dress with barely disguised disdain. "This is Emily," Alexander said proudly, his voice firm. "She's important to me." The woman's smile faltered, and for a moment, silence hung between them. Then she gave a polite nod, the kind that wasn't polite at all, and walked away. Emily's chest tightened. She whispered, "I don't fit here. You can't pretend I do." Alexander turned to her, his eyes burning with sincerity. "You fit everywhere I am. That's all that matters." But when they left the gallery that night, Emily's mind was heavy with doubt. Love was one thing, but the weight of his world was another. Could she really walk into it without being crushed? Back at her small apartment, she sat by the window, staring at the city lights. She thought about her dream of owning a house. Not a mansion, not a palace, but a little place with a garden where she could plant flowers. A place that would be hers, earned by her own hands. She had spent her whole life working toward that independence, that dignity. Could she risk losing herself in his world, even for love? Meanwhile, Alexander lay awake in his vast, lonely estate. He thought about the way people had looked at her, the cruelty in their whispers, and rage burned inside him. He had seen enough of the empty high society life to know one thing. He wanted no part of it if it meant losing her. The next morning, Alexander showed up at Emily's door, unannounced but determined. He carried nothing, wore no suit, no mask of wealth, just himself. "Come with me," he said, his eyes full of quiet urgency. She hesitated. "Where?" "You'll see." They drove for hours, leaving the city behind. Emily watched as skyscrapers gave way to open fields, as the horizon stretched wide and free. Finally, they stopped in a small town where the houses were simple, modest, but filled with warmth. Alexander led her to a little property on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small cottage with peeling paint, a broken fence, and a garden overrun with weeds. But when Emily saw it, her breath caught in her throat. "It's for sale," Alexander said softly. "I thought, this is the kind of place you dream of, isn't it? A home, not a palace. a place to belong. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Why would you do this?" "Because I want to build something real with you," he said. "Not in my world. Not in yours. Somewhere new, somewhere that's ours. I don't care what people think, Emily. Care about you, about us." She looked at the house, then at him, her heart torn between gratitude, fear, and a love she could no longer deny. And in that moment, standing before the little cottage with its broken fence and wild garden, Emily realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before. Maybe, just maybe, love could be enough to build a life. But the road ahead would not be simple. The world would not stop whispering. And even in their shared dream, challenges waited. Ones that would test not only their love, but the strength of who they were as individuals. Still, as Alexander reached for her hand and she didn't pull away, the story of their future began to take root in the soil of possibility. And yet, despite all of this love that surrounded her, a quiet longing remained inside her heart. It was not a longing for more material things or for grandeur or for luxury. It was a longing to truly know whether the connection she shared with Adrian was one that could stand the test of time, or if it was something fleeting born out of gratitude and the fragility of his illness. She never voiced this doubt to anyone, not even to Rosa, because part of her feared that giving voice to it would weaken the bond she cherished so deeply. Adrian, too, wrestled with his own thoughts. He wondered what would happen if his family's influence weighed too heavily on her, if the world began whispering that she was only with him for his wealth, or if she herself felt out of place in a world that had not been hers by birth. And yet, every time he looked at her, every time her hand brushed against his, he was reminded of how little the world's opinion mattered compared to the simple truth of how he felt when she was near. One evening, after weeks of enjoying quiet routines and tender conversations, Adrian surprised her. He took her hand as they strolled through the garden of the estate, the air carrying the scent of blooming roses, and he spoke with a trembling earnestness that Maria had never seen in him before. "Maria," he said, his voice low but steady, "I cannot deny what I feel for you. Every day that passes, I realize more and more that you are the reason I fight so hard to heal. You gave me hope when I had none. And I need you to know, I love you." Maria froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She had imagined this moment countless times in the stillness of the night, but hearing it spoken aloud was overwhelming. She felt tears welling in her eyes, not out of sadness but from the sheer force of emotion that surged through her. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I love you too, more than I ever thought I could." For a moment, it seemed as though the world had stopped. The night air, the gentle sway of the trees, the stars above, all of it felt like a silent witness to a love that had been born in the most unlikely of places. He leaned closer, and though they did not seal their words with a kiss, the closeness between them felt like something eternal, something untouchable by time or circumstance. But even as they confessed their feelings, both knew deep inside that their story was not meant to follow the traditional path of marriage and vows. Their connection was not bound by rings or ceremonies. It was something freer, something that transcended the expectations of society. They both understood, without saying it aloud, that what they shared was real and powerful, and that it did not require the approval of others to be true. In the days that followed, their love blossomed in quiet ways. They shared laughter during walks, found comfort in silence, and created a rhythm together that felt like home. Adrian's health improved steadily, and Maria found herself marveling at the transformation not only in his body but also in his spirit. He was no longer the fragile young man fighting despair. He was vibrant, hopeful, and alive, and she had played a part in that rebirth. Yet, Maria remained steadfast in her dream. She continued to save diligently, and one morning, Adrian noticed the small jar on her bedside table filled with bills and coins. He picked it up curiously, turning it in his hands, and asked softly, "What is this?" Maria flushed, embarrassed to have her private dream exposed. "It's my savings. For a house, a small one, somewhere quiet, where I can build a life of my own." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He placed the jar back gently and said, "Then let's make that dream real." Maria's eyes widened. "Adrian, no. This is mine. I don't want charity. I want to earn it." Adrian took her hands in his gaze steady and filled with warmth. "Maria, this isn't charity. This is love. I don't want to take your dream from you. I want to stand beside you as you reach it. Let's find that house together. Not as an escape, not as a gift, but as the place where we can continue to be who we are, free from everything else." And in that moment, Maria realized something she had never allowed herself to see before, that Adrian wasn't asking her to give up her independence, her dignity, or her dreams. He was asking her to let him be part of them. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, let's find it together." Their journey was not about marriage or about fitting into the mold that society expected. Instead, it became about building a life on their own terms. They searched for weeks until they found a small, beautiful home on the edge of the countryside, surrounded by fields of wildflowers and kissed by the warmth of the sun. It was not grand, but it was perfect. It was theirs. When they moved in, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time, she stood in a place that was both her dream and his. A home where love lived not in titles or expectations, but in everyday acts of kindness and shared laughter. And though they never wore rings or stood before an altar, everyone who saw them together could sense the bond that tied them. It was in the way Adrian's eyes softened when he looked at her, in the way Maria's laughter filled the rooms of their home, in the way their hands always seemed to find each other without thought. Their story did not end with a wedding, but with something far greater, a love that was free, resilient, and profoundly real. Maria had found her home, not only in the walls she had dreamed of, but in the heart of a man who loved her for exactly who she was. And Adrian, who had once believed his life was slipping away, had found a reason to live that no wealth or power could ever replace. Together, they wrote a story not bound by conventions but by the truth of their hearts. And in that truth, they discovered the kind of happiness that no ending could ever diminish. Maria stood at the doorway of their small countryside home, watching the horizon burn with shades of gold and crimson as the sun set behind the hills. The fields of wildflowers swayed gently in the evening breeze, carrying with it the fragrance of earth and blossoms, a reminder of the quiet life she had always dreamed of. For so long, she had believed that her dream of a home was only about walls and a roof, a physical place where she could finally belong. But now, as she turned and looked at Adrian sitting on the porch steps, she realized her dream had been deeper all along. Home was not a building. Home was him. Adrian glanced up, catching her gaze, and his smile carried the same warmth it had the day he first told her he loved her. His health had returned in full, his body strong, his spirit vibrant. But beyond that, something inside him had shifted. He was no longer the man bound by expectations, by the chains of a wealthy family's demands. He had chosen his own freedom, just as she had chosen hers, and together they had created something rare, love without conditions. "Come sit," he said softly, patting the spot beside him. She joined him, the wooden step creaking under their weight, and for a long moment they simply sat in silence, the world around them unfolding in its quiet beauty. "I used to think," Adrian began, his voice low and thoughtful, "that happiness would come from achieving everything my family wanted me to. The perfect career, the perfect marriage, the perfect image. But the truth is, I've never felt more complete than I do here, with you, in this simple house." Maria leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart swelling. "And I used to think happiness would only come if I proved to the world that I could stand on my own. That if I earned everything with my own two hands, then I'd finally be enough. But the truth is, I was already enough. I just needed to believe it. And I never would have learned that if I hadn't met you." Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining effortlessly, like two rivers merging into one. It wasn't the kind of love that needed an audience, or vows, or grand declarations. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable. It was love in the way she made him tea in the mornings, in the way he warmed her hands on cold nights, in the way they both found comfort in silence. Not everyone understood their choice. Some whispered behind closed doors that Adrian should have married into another wealthy family, or that Maria should have pressed him for marriage while she had the chance. Others wondered why they lived so modestly when Adrian's family still possessed riches beyond measure. But none of that mattered. Their love did not fit neatly into anyone's expectations, because it wasn't meant to. It was theirs, and that was enough. Years passed, and their bond only deepened. Maria filled their little home with warmth. Plants by the windows, shelves of books, the smell of bread fresh from the oven. Adrian tended the garden. His once ailing body now strong enough to carry baskets of vegetables they grew together. Life was simple, but it was abundant in all the ways that mattered. One autumn evening, as the air turned crisp and the leaves painted the ground in hues of red and gold, Adrian turned to her with a look that made her heart stop. "Maria," he said, his eyes glistening in the firelight, "do you ever regret that we didn't, do things the way everyone expected?" Maria shook her head, a soft smile gracing her lips. "Not for a moment. We didn't need a wedding to prove our love, Adrian. We live it every single day. And besides," she squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with quiet certainty, "we chose each other. That's what matters." Adrian's breath caught, and he pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. "You're right, always." And in that moment, Maria knew that their story was not about defying tradition for the sake of rebellion, nor about clinging to independence at the cost of love. It was about finding a balance between two souls who had both longed for something real, something lasting, something true. They didn't need the world's approval. They didn't need titles or rings. What they had was more profound. A love that was free yet deeply rooted. A love that had begun in a hospital room, fragile and uncertain, and had grown into a bond stronger than time. As the years unfolded, people who visited their little home often said the same thing. "There's something here, something different." They couldn't quite explain it, but they felt it in the air, in the walls, in the way Maria and Adrian looked at one another. It was the kind of love that reminded people of what truly mattered. Not wealth, not appearances, not expectations, but the simple act of choosing each other every day. And so their story came to rest, not with a wedding march, not with a final kiss beneath stained glass windows, but with a life lived fully, authentically, and joyfully. Maria had her house, Adrian had his freedom, and together they had built a love that endured not because of what the world said it should be, but because of what they knew it already was. And in the quiet of their home, surrounded by wildflowers and golden sunsets, they discovered the greatest truth of all. Sometimes, the happiest endings aren't the ones we expect, but the ones we dare to create for ourselves.